Revising a speech is trickier than writing one from scratch. That's because all of us have a tendency to fall in love with our words, with our own words. That's too bad, because to revise a speech is to revision it, to see it in a new way. Very often, that produces a better speech than the original. The original version of Lloyd Smith's speech tonight was inspired by an acquaintance who once told him that writing an entertaining speech about a technical topic, such as the history of the English language, would be impossible. Lloyd has given this speech in front of several audiences in several different forms. One of them was the time the scheduled target speaker at a Division A evaluation contest got stage fright and ran away about 10 minutes before the start of the contest. This evening for Project 2, evaluation and feedback in Level 1 of the Visionary Communication Path, Lloyd will present his latest revision. After some cutting, rewording, and restructuring, the speech is about 50% different than the original. Lloyd Smith and Ralphie's Word.
In the classic holiday film A Christmas Story, there's a scene where Ralphie is helping his dad change a flat tire. When the lug nuts get knocked out of his hand and fly off into the snowy darkness, Ralphie says, "Oh, fudge!" But the narrator tells us, "I didn't say fudge. I said the word, the big one." A couple scenes later, Ralphie's getting his mouth washed out with a bar of Lifebuoy soap. Now, if you ever had a Ralphie moment in your childhood, you probably wondered the same thing I wondered during my Ralphie moments. What makes the word the word? Why is it that there are some words you can say in public with no problem, while there are other words that mean essentially the same thing that caused a tremendous reaction? As it happens, those of us who are experts in the history of the English language know that there is a simple answer to that question. King Harold II had problems seeing what his army was doing during the Battle of Hastings. Are there any questions? There are a few details I left out. The story begins in the spring of the year 1066, when the king of Britain, Edward the Confessor, died without leaving a suitable male heir. The Anglo-Saxon nobles met together and picked one of their own, Harold Godwinson, the head of the richest family in England and the king's brother-in-law, to be the new king. He was crowned 3 days later. Now that news didn't sit well with everyone. In Norway, Harald Hardrada, the king of the Vikings, was particularly unhappy. His father and the late King Edward were illegitimate half-brothers, and Harald thought that that gave him a far better claim on the British throne than Harold had. At the same time, over in Normandy, the northwest corner of France, Duke William was equally unhappy. That's because he and the late King Edward were first cousins, and he thought he had a far better claim on the throne than Harold had. Now, back in England, Harold knew what was getting ready to happen. Harald Hardrada had assembled his Viking chieftains and told them to get ready to invade England, and Duke William had assembled his French vassals and told them to get ready to invade England. Harold was in a quandary because he didn't know which way the invasion was going to come. That question was answered for him when a messenger galloped into his castle in London and told them that the Vikings had landed in Kent, a little bit to the northeast. Harold got his army together, marched them 50 miles in a day and a half, which was an amazing feat for a medieval army, and met the onrushing Vikings at a little town called Stamford Bridge. Instead of waiting and positioning themselves for battle, Harold ordered an immediate attack. The surprised Vikings began to fall back, the retreat turned into a rout, and half of the Viking warriors were killed on the way back to the beach. Then the surviving half, ran into a gigantic storm in the North Sea, and half of them were killed. It was the end of the Viking Age in Europe. Harold felt pretty good for about a day and a half until a messenger rode into his castle to tell him that the Norman French had just landed on the southeastern coast. He got his depleted, beaten up army together, forced marched them 75 miles in 3 days, and encountered the oncoming Norman French at a little town called Hastings. The two armies were actually quite equal to each other, and they spent 2 weeks maneuvering around this little valley, trying to get position on one another before the battle started. When the battle did start, the same thing happened that happened in every single battle in medieval times. Dust and dirt and noise made it impossible to figure out what was going on. King Harold decided the thing to do was to ride up onto the top of this little hill so he could get a better vantage point on what was happening. He did. Unfortunately for him, the first thing he saw when he lifted the visor of his helmet was the French arrow that hit him in the left eye and killed him. The leaderless British army disintegrated. Duke William captured all of the British noble and gave them a choice. They could be killed immediately or they could name him king. When you explain things clearly to people, they tend to see it your way, and so King William I was the new king of England. Now, good for him, but what does that have to do with Ralphie getting his mouth washed out with a bar of soap? It's a question of language. The British at the time spoke a language we now call Anglo-Saxon or Old English. It's a Germanic language that came into England about 500 years before the battle, brought in by the Angles and Saxons who invaded from the northern part of Europe. At the same time, the French back then were speaking a language called Old French. It's a very different language. It was derived from Latin when the Roman Empire broke up about 500 or 600 years ahead of the battle. Both of the languages are in the Indo-European language family, but they're very different from one another in terms of vocabulary, syntax, and grammar. When the Norman French took over England, Duke William had hundreds and hundreds of Norman officials come in to help run everything. And the official language of Britain became French. However, out in the villages and towns and whatnot, where the two groups intertwined with one another, the languages also intermingled into what linguists call a creole with a small c. It's an amalgamation of a couple of languages with one of them being dominant. In this case, Old French was the dominant language. What happened as the years went on was a simple process. The Old French words were the language of the rich, the powerful, the winners, and the Old English words became the language of the losers, the powerless, the poor. We still see that today in modern English. That's why in a restaurant you will see pork on a menu, but you won't see pig. Pork is a word derived from Latin, pig is derived from Anglo-Saxon English. The same thing is true with beef and cow. You'll see beef on the menu, but not cow. That also applies to the words that refer to bodily functions. If I say the word intercourse, for example, nobody in here will react. But if I say the Anglo-Saxon word, the four-letter word beginning with an F, Ralphie's word, there will probably be a reaction. In other words, the words that are seen as obscene or profane today by us have nothing to do with the meaning of the word. They have to do with the social class and the economic background of how that word got placed in our language. English is the largest language on earth, has almost 500,000 vocabulary words, and roughly half of them come from each language. It's too bad Ralphie's mom didn't know that before she stuck that bar of soap in his mouth.